Welcome to Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. U.S. President Joe Biden delivered his first foreign policy speech announcing that, quote-unquote, America is back and diplomacy will be at the center of U.S. foreign policy. How will he work to restore America's alliances? Biden also called China America's most serious competitor. But he also said Washington is willing to work with Beijing in the U.S.'s own interests. How will Biden's China policy be different from that of Trump? We'll have three leading experts to shed some light on these issues. Robert Kelly is professor from the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University. Jove Toker is professor from the American Graduate School in Paris. And Huang Jing is dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University. But first, here's our own correspondent, Owen Fairclough, reporting from Washington, D.C.
Diplomacy is back, the words of new U.S. President Joe Biden in his first major foreign policy address, setting out his ambitions for his new administration. And this was very much about breaking with the Trump administration's policy. For example, former President Donald Trump wanted closer relations with Saudi Arabia. Biden has announced that the U.S. will withdraw its support for the Saudi-led coalition fighting Houthi rebels backed by Iran in Yemen. And where the Trump administration was characterized by threatening to withdraw from multilateral institutions and turning its back on some allies, Biden wants to embrace them in a new era of international cooperation.
Over the past 2 weeks, I've spoken with the leaders of many of our closest friends: Canada, Mexico, the UK, Germany, France, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, to being reforming the habits of cooperation and rebuilding the muscle of democratic alliances that have atrophied over the past few years of neglect and, I would argue, abuse.
But there are limits to this cooperation. While Washington and Moscow have extended their treaty curbing their most destructive long-range nuclear missiles, Biden has said that he will confront Russia over its attempts to rig multiple elections here in the United States and beyond. And China has been described by Biden's administration as the single most important relationship, a relationship that deteriorated badly under the Trump administration with a trade war that was largely destructive to U.S. businesses. Biden says he wants to change the tone of this relationship, even if the substance may remain the same, with Trump-era tariffs on Chinese imports into the United States remaining in place for now.
We'll also take on directly the challenges posed by our prosperity, security, and democratic values by our most serious competitor, China. But we are ready to work with Beijing when it's in America's interest to do so.
Many of these foreign policy themes are familiar for any U.S. administration, but the situation in Myanmar does pose a major test for Biden, with the military takeover of the Democrat-elected government there led by Aung San Suu Kyi. Many Western allies and the United Nations are now discussing the reimposition of sanctions amid calls for the military to release Aung San Suu Kyi from detention. And while Biden has joined in those calls, he stopped short in this speech of declaring sanctions on Myanmar for now. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Well, Robert, let me go to you first. Can U.S.-EU ties get back to where it was?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, I think one of the unfortunate lessons for American allies of the Trump administration is their extraordinary dependence on the United States, right? I mean, one of the predictions that's been made for a while is that if the United States began to really misbehave, American allies would start to hedge or drift away or build relationships on their own. The most important test of that was that the Europeans might build their own kind of defense identity, some kind of really integrated European pillar inside NATO. And they didn't. And they didn't, you know, and in Asia, for example, Korea, South Korea, and Japan didn't, you know, suddenly have better relations with each other because the Americans drifted away. The antagonistic relationship between Korea and Japan continues. So as long as America's allies don't sort of come together when America misbehaves, that creates room for the United States to misbehave again, right? But it also means that when you get sort of a return to normality, as you have with Biden, that America's allies will probably close ranks. You know, if America's allies really want to drift, they're just going to have to spend a lot more money on defense. And a lot of them just aren't willing to do that. So I would imagine that, yes, actually, America's allies will return to the fold. And, Biden's a pretty establishment guy, too, right? I mean, Biden believes in the neoliberal, or excuse me, the liberal hegemony or the liberal international order. Biden believes in institutions like NATO and the WHO and the WTO and stuff like that. So I would imagine that, you'll see it coming together on both sides quite comfortably, actually.
Yeah, but Beijing obviously has gained, I wouldn't say the upper hand, but more weight in those global institutions, be it WHO or the United Nations, World Bank. It'll be really interesting to see how Biden works with Beijing, or perhaps not with Beijing, through those multilateral systems. Mr. Toker, Professor Toker, let me go to you. Some analysts say that Europeans' attitudes towards the United States have changed. A lot of people in Europe think that the U.S. political system is somewhat broken, and Europe cannot just rely on the United States to defend itself. So how much will Biden's speech appeal? How has Biden's speech appealed to his European audience?
Well, the speech, which I would define as sort of a format address, because it repeated many of the themes we have been familiar with during the presidential campaign, and was to a large extent expected, as Joe Biden is a major figure on American foreign policy for decades now. There are no elements of surprise in that sense. There were in the speech some nuances here and there, some new corners that we may perhaps pay attention to with some meaning. So the speech was very well received in European chancelleries, and it's obvious. This is to say that I'm not sure we can just wrap it up globally by saying that America is back, and then we just replacing the cursor 4 years forward after the 4 years of the Trump administration. Now, 4 years is not a very long period of time, of course, on the scale of history, but it is a considerable amount of time in the rhythm in which world affairs are on the march in our modern global crisis-struck global scene. So things have been done during those 4 years that, in spite of the goodwill and in spite of some of the deep convictions and less deep convictions of the Biden administration, the 4 years of Trump presidency would keep some marks, would maintain some signs, that it would take some energy and some time and some prioritization in order to erase them, in spite of I believe, the honest, sincere ambition of the Trump administration, indeed, to erase them.
Right. One thing, a specific item that Biden did say was he will stop the pulling out of troops from Germany. And he said America will, under his administration, conduct a review of how American forces will be deployed globally. So, Professor Huang Jing, let me go to you. How do you expect the U.S. will, under Biden, reconfigure its military deployment, which Biden said will be in accordance with its foreign policy objectives?
I think because Biden administration, of course, says very differently from what Donald Trump says, especially its relationship with major countries in Europe. For example, Germany, we know that the relationship between the United States and Germany, France, all those major European countries did not go very well. And one of the demonstrations of this, not so well relationship is that Donald Trump will withdraw troops from Germany and redeploy them in Poland. But now Biden stopped that. Means, number one, Biden is going to seriously reconsider relationship or review the relationship between the United States and those major European allies. The second, of course, is so-called de-Trumpianism, and that will undo whatever Trump has done and will put focus back again on the traditional allies which play some major role in Europe, that is Germany and France. Last but not the least, of course, Biden's approach is more compromising-oriented rather than Donald Trump's conflict-oriented. So I think that this is a very positive sign from a European point of view that Biden has stopped, withdraw troops from Germany. It's very positive. I think that's a very good first step in terms of U.S.-Europe relationship, especially U.S. and the Germany relationship.
Professor Huang, I want to stay with you, talking about America's alliances around the world. Asia Pacific is a big part of it. Think about the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, and its quasi-alliance or partner countries such as Singapore. Do you think there will be a pivot to Asia 2.0, or as some say, an Asian NATO under Biden?
I think that, of course, United States want to get the allies back. And one element I think Biden administration will, carry on from Donald Trump's position, administration is a so-called, Indian Pacific strategy or Indian Pacific relationship. But I think Biden administration has to realize today's Asia is no longer the Asia in 2016 or so on, because there has been changed in two prospects. Number one is, of course, China has become stronger and more influential, despite all those competition between United States and China, despite all those trade wars, especially this pandemic. China has been doing very well. And secondly, is that all the Asian countries, including American allies, may have a different view about relationship in the region as well as its relationship with the United States. The major ally countries like Japan, South Korea, Philippines, so on and so forth, all of them has expressed a little bit hesitation at least, or some of them even openly said they don't want to take side between United States and China. Other countries like Singapore or Thailand and others, which still have a good relationship with United States, also said they don't want to take positions. They don't say it serves Asia's interests for United States and China to go head-on against each other. And last but not least, of course, Biden administration has to realize Donald Trump administration did much damage of the relationship between United States and its Asian allies because of the so-called U.S. first unilateral approach. How to repair this damage is another challenge for the Biden administration.
Right. Robert, just now you mentioned the liberal worldview of Biden and his fellow Democrats. Do you think there will necessarily be more U.S. intervention globally, or at least in key hotspot areas such as the Middle East, under Joe Biden and Antony Blinken? Because Blinken said U.S. foreign policy should be complemented with force if necessary.
Sure, and I think any American Secretary of State will say that the United States is a superpower. It's a very large state with military force deployed all over the world. So at minimum, American, officials always have to make it sound like there's sort of, steel inside the glove. So I think that's sort of par for the course. But no, I think the pretty obvious lesson that the American establishment has drawn from the Iraq War, particularly, is that the United States needs to be a lot more careful about intervention. Right? I mean, probably the one good thing that Donald Trump, the one sort of unambiguously good thing that Donald Trump did as president was he avoided new wars, right? And Obama, of course, scaled down too. Obama had a few interventions, but nothing like what had preceded him. And of course, American public opinion is strongly against that. Biden, I think, is an establishment kind of guy, right? He's from the blob, right? The term sort of for the U.S. foreign policy community, which has a kind of general interest in American sort of forward positioning and intervention around the world. But I don't think that Biden is actually anything like a neocon. He realizes what's happened to presidents before him who've gotten sucked into vortexes like Iraq and Vietnam. So no, I don't think so. For example, like on Myanmar, I don't think there's going to be anything like sanctions or any kind of major American effort to get involved, right? Biden's talking about some kind of retrenchment from Yemen. I would imagine he'll try to keep the footprint in the Middle East small, but he won't be able to get out. The Middle East has proven very difficult for the United States to get out of. But I don't think the United States, barring some, some extraordinary crisis like the implosion of North Korea or something like that. No, I don't think Biden will do any kind of major interventions.
Professor Toker, what kind of a partner does Europe want to see from Biden and his America?
Well, as we all know, the first reactions of the Europeans once the elections were over in America is just to breathe, because things have become recomforting once this Trump period was over. So, you know, what happened to Europeans during those 4 years was in some way not very new in essence. I mean, the fact that indeed Europeans had to think about their defense system, about their overall global approach to continents other than theirs, because the American presence was not as sure as it was taken for granted for 50 years or more in European terms. These are trends and subcurrents which were present, which were there on the European theater prior to Trump and prior to the victory of Biden over Trump. So, of course, all these issues became more urgent and more confusing and added to sort of an overall defensive approach of the Europeans, because they were taken by such a surprise, but by so many of the Trump agenda points. So indeed, now there is, if you wish, a restabilization of the overall vision, but it doesn't take away, for example, a crucial problem, which is to what extent do Europeans actually desire and can afford an independent, significant defense structure. This is a question which Europeans on all sides of the political levels in different European countries are debating over for 30, 40 years, right? It had been accelerated, it got some urgency due to the Trump years, but these are not new. And in this sense, the Trump years would have an effect.
Right, I want to move on and talk about
position-taking.
China-U.S. relations for a moment. Biden called China America's most serious competitor. You probably heard this by now. Professor Huang, let me go to you. Other than Trump, who of course has been saying that China is a rival since 2017, if you think about it, no previous U.S. administrations really outwardly or officially said China is the most serious competitor, right? Not Obama, not Bush, not Clinton, not Bush 41. How should we understand Joe Biden's message?
I think that it's a kind of consensus by U.S. establishment, Republicans or Democrats, that China is serious competitors. First, China is getting stronger and stronger. Second, China has a totally different political system. And the last but not the least, of course, China seems to set up a different example for the rest of the world to follow, or at least to look. So if the United States feels threatened, and not just because China is getting stronger, but because the United States perceive China as setting up a new international order or try to revise the existing international order that established and maintained by the United States since World War II. That's why some pundits in the United States believe China is a revisionist power, is no longer a status quo power. It's from that point of view that Biden addressed China as a serious competitor. But on the other hand, Biden also said that the United States, under his leadership, will work with China if it works for United States interests. But if you look at...
That is a message for his domestic audience rather than to Beijing, no?
I think it's also for Beijing, because if you look, yes, it's also mostly for domestic audience. But if you look at the context, and really what he said is that Biden administration, or Biden himself, has shown a very strong position or stance on China. Said, you're my competitor, so I'm playing tough on you. But on the other hand, it feels short of substance. A few days ago, Biden's spokesperson said that Biden will want to be patient with China. So the patience is the key in his policy towards China. If that's the case, I would argue that maybe there's some very serious debate or discussion about China policy within Biden's administration. So he want to, of course, Biden's priority list is that he want to rebuild the U.S. alliance system first, therefore to restore the so-called American leadership, and from there organize a so-called united front against China, but that takes time. So Biden has to take care of the alliance system first, and second, have to form a kind of foundation or consensus at home second, then before he can work out a so-called comprehensive and consistent China policy framework.
Yeah, really.
But now we don't see any substance right now, even though we did say he has demonstrated a very strong and a tough position vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, foreign policy starts at home. On Friday, today, Beijing also responded to Joe Biden's foreign policy speech. I want to play you what China's foreign ministry has just said.
We hope that the U.S. will follow the public opinion of the two countries and the trend of the times to look at China and bilateral relations in an objective and rational manner. We hope the U.S. will adopt a positive and constructive policy towards China, focus on cooperation, manage differences, promote healthy and stable development of bilateral ties, and work with the international community to advance the noble cause of world peace and development.
Robert, what's your response, reaction, thoughts when you heard about China's response to Biden?
Yeah, I think it was pretty accurate, right? I don't think it's sort of an exaggeration or excessively hawkish to refer to China as a competitor to the United States at this point. I think basically everybody agrees that these two states are very large and they're sort of increasingly sort of at friction particularly in East Asia. I don't think that means that we are on the cusp of a Cold War. I don't think we need to talk ourselves into that. I would encourage avoiding that kind of rhetoric. For example, your other guest spoke about a united front against China. I don't actually think that's accurate. I don't think the United States is doing anything like that. I think we could get to that. But if you actually look at American public opinion data, the Chicago Council just released its big annual report on U.S. public opinion in foreign policy, and they find that the American public is not actually as hawkish on China as the foreign policy community, the blob. And that's a good thing, right? And we've also found there's also a lot of data that suggests that opinions on China are polarized politically within the United States, which is to say that Republicans are more hawkish on China than Democrats, and that all has a lot to do with internal domestic polarization rather than how much Americans know about China. So I would sort of caution everybody to be real careful about sort of like using this kind of rhetoric, right? It's inevitable that the two biggest countries are going to have collisions and they're going to sort of like have frictions and disagreements, and there's going to be a lot of sort of military tension sort of floating around in the background. But I don't think we need to sort of talk ourselves into a Cold War. It's one of the reasons why I'm glad that Donald Trump is no longer president, because I think Trump was actually using that kind of rhetoric basically to get himself off the hook for COVID, right? I mean, Trump didn't do a very good job on COVID, and he found out that he could sort of change the subject, blame shift to China, start talking about the China virus, spinning up a Cold War with China to excuse himself for his failures at home, right? So I would encourage any Chinese viewers not to sort of like overread this rhetoric. That calling China a competitor is not the same thing as saying it's an enemy or an opponent, or we have to have an arms race with them.
Yeah.
You know, we're not near that. I mean, we can probably, which is to say the United States and China, can probably work out rules for the road in East Asia, right? I still think that's possible. We don't have to go over the edge. The Biden people want to come back into the WTO, which means we can probably get away from the trade war. So I still think there's a lot of space for us to avoid any kind of really serious friction. I think Biden's trying to signal that. I don't think it was particularly hawkish.
Yeah, Biden said they're rivals of America, they're competitors of America. He didn't designate China as a rival, at least. I don't think he said that about Russia either, other than on the cyberspace. Professor Toker, let me go to you. Biden said he will confront Beijing along with allies on the issues of human rights, intellectual property, economic policy, and this is interesting. He said on global governance. This is kind of new. Is that, in your opinion, Biden's way of saying global dominance?
Oh, well, if you wish to apply a harsher interpretation, you may think about that. I would tend rather to interpret it as way of on Biden's side, as a way of referring to the new multilateral and perhaps also the Chinese-American bilateral type of dialogue. I think that what Biden was trying to say to the address of Beijing, including this sentence, was we are monitoring what you're doing, what you're saying, and what you're insinuating on world scene, and including what you're doing within your own, on your own land, right? The reference to human rights and democratization and what he called our liberal values in the West and in America, which as was commented on in the studio, is something which is a comfortable thing to say through the eyes of American internal scene, which has been accustomed for generations to this message of the America being the so-called leader of the free world and carrying on its shoulders values. Now, these elements are often being looked upon in a cynical way when you do foreign policy and defense and trade analysis. I think that this Biden administration honestly believe in those values, and I would think that both in China, in Russia, in Turkey, in Brazil, in many other spots over the world, there may be some surprises on this front which will be re-employed more and more so, not just more than the Trump administration had used to, actually had turned its back to, but also in terms of comparison to perhaps Obama or Bush administrations.
Right. Professor Huang, to what extent do you think Biden's goal of rebuilding alliances, restoring American leadership globally will hurt his domestic agenda? Because if you look, U.S. military budget accounts for over 40% of its discretionary spending. And in today's America, there are so many problems domestically, from infrastructure inequality to lingering opioid crisis to poverty.
Yeah, I think that actually Biden's most formidable challenges come from within. That is, the divided nation of the United States will be the most difficult part for him to do his policies. So, there are about 74 million voters vote against him for Donald Trump. All those voters, they believe that the United States should not take so much responsibilities or commitment to the so-called international peace and order. They think the United States should really put its own interest first, should take full advantage of the United States' mighty power, and so therefore to make America again the so-called MAGA movement. It is in that way they support Donald Trump's unilateralism under the banner of America First. Of course, what Joe Biden wants to do, if he really wants to rebuild or restore the alliance system, reestablish U.S. leadership, Biden has to return to multilateralism, has to make more compromise in dealing with American allies and the rest of the world. All of this, of course, is a big no, is a very, very bad for those conservative forces, basically those Trump supporters. So if Joe Biden cannot overcome those oppositions at home, and I don't think he can do that much, especially we know that in 2022 we're going to have a midterm examination of the U.S. Congress. If Democrats under Biden's leadership cannot do very well, cannot manage or control those midterm elections, maybe Joe Biden will have a very hard battle to do in the 2024 re-election. So I would argue that whether Joe Biden can really achieve what he has desired or has described to us depends to what extent he can overcome opposition at home. And the bad news, of course, is that this opposition is very strong.
Robert, to what extent do you think Joe Biden's foreign policy will be constrained by domestic politics, especially those on the right?
Significantly. Biden's going to spend the first 2 years basically tackling COVID. The United States is now at almost 500,000 deaths, something like close to 30 million cases. It's going to take a long, long time to get it. I think that we're all getting a little bit too carried away with the sort of vaccines that are on the cusp. This is going to be with us for a while, especially in the United States, where it's really just sort of spun out of control. And then, of course, there's the deep partisan polarization in the United States, which has led to, as we saw, the storming of the Capitol. And now there's this big debate about sort of these conspiracy theories inside the Republican Party and whether or not, so you got right-wing groups that are going to use violence in American politics and stuff like that. That's going to absorb an enormous amount of Joe Biden's energy, right? So, I mean, for example, if you listen to the foreign policy speech, he didn't even mention North Korea, right? Which sort of people in my space were like, why didn't he talk about it? It's like, well, because he
lots of domestic constraints there, Robert. I'm sorry to cut you, but that's all the time we have. Thank you so very much, gentlemen. And thank you for our viewers in China and around the world for watching Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.